September the 18th, 1931, Japanese and Chinese troops clash in Manchuria. This is how the Times reported the incident.
Collision at Mukden. Conflicting reports. City occupied by Japanese.
The next 4 days, Japanese forces occupied other Chinese towns within a 200-mile radius of Mukden. It was open war between China and Japan. The Chinese leader, Chiang Kai-shek, told his people that he had appealed to the League of Nations to help in the dispute. He said,
"The League of Nations was established to prevent war and bring collective action into play to stop aggression. We have immediately informed the League of the aggression and have asked it to obtain, as a first step, the immediate withdrawal of the invader."
The Japanese invasion of Manchuria was the first real test for the League of Nations as a force for world peace. Never before had it been called upon to adjudicate in a war between two of its member states. How would the League of Nations respond to the challenge posed by the conflict between China and Japan? Victory Day in London, November the 15th, 1919. Peace had come at last to a war-weary Britain. There were amazing scenes of public revelry and rejoicing. The country, said one observer, became like a giant school let out. London was celebrating the end of the Great War. 10 million people had died. Britain alone had lost nearly 800,000 men. France nearly twice as many.
The impact of the First World War produced a tremendous revulsion with war and a determination that it mustn't happen again. In Britain, there was a universal demand for a League of Nations. There was tremendous support, and the same is true actually of France and Germany and Austria and Italy. There was enormous support for the idea of a League of Nations.
The American President Woodrow Wilson is generally regarded as the father of the League of Nations. At the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, delegates agreed with him that the peoples of the world must act together to prevent the outbreak of future wars. Most people welcomed the idea of a League of Nations, including the British Prime Minister, David Lloyd George.
"I look forward to the League of Nations to remedy, to repair and to redress. It will be there as a court of appeal to readjust crudities, irregularities, injustices."
In 1920, the home of the League was fixed in Geneva. A new era seemed to have dawned. In particular, the threat of war was to be dealt with by collective security, nations standing firmly together in the face of aggression. There would be conciliation instead of conflict.
When the Covenant of the League of Nations was drafted, it included in Article 16 provision for, first, economic sanctions, if aggression was persisted in, and then military sanctions. Economic sanctions meant refusing to trade with the aggressor, depriving him of the means of waging war. Military sanctions meant declaring war on him.
But there were weaknesses in the League. The new communist government in Russia refused to join. Germany was excluded until 1926. And most damaging of all, America, suspicious of plunging into world politics, decided to keep out.
One British Foreign Minister, Austin Chamberlain, said in 1925 that if ever they had realised that the United States would not be a member of the League, Britain would never have signed the Covenant. And I think this would have been true of the French as well. The League was flawed from the start because the one power whose presence was absolutely essential was not a member.
Yet, despite these flaws, the 1920s were a honeymoon period for the League. Membership increased steadily. It intervened successfully in a number of minor disputes between member countries. But the honeymoon didn't last for long.
My countrymen.
In 1929, Herbert Hoover became President of the United States. He was proud and confident. "We have more cars," he said, "more bathtubs, more silk stockings, more bank accounts than any other people on earth." But in October 1929, the American dream crashed.
Office in the service of our people.
In the richest country in the world, in towering Wall Street, disaster. The money castles came crashing down and fortunes dissolved in a day. The canker of depression began to spread, leaving in its wake a waste of silent factories and an army without hope.
People literally starved as companies went bankrupt and banks closed. Industrial production dropped by 50%. Unemployment rose from 2 million in 1929 to 11 million in 1933. The Wall Street crash was to be felt all round the world. The prices of foodstuffs and raw materials collapsed. World trade slumped.
The Great Crash in 1929 was perhaps the most serious problem that the great powers had to face in interwar years. What it produced was a growing economic nationalism, a sharpening of imperial rivalry, a breakdown of the will to cooperate between the great powers. But significantly, the powers hit most severely by the slump, Germany and Japan, were the powers that then went on to disrupt international affairs in the 1930s.
In the period of some 60 years, Japan had emerged from isolation to become a world power. Her population had doubled in that period and was still increasing at the tremendous rate of about 900,000 a year. But Japan's prosperity was fragile. The country lacked important raw materials like iron, coal, oil, which had to be imported. To pay for this, Japan had to export or die. The world slump proved a cruel blow.
When the Great Crash came, and Japanese goods were discriminated against, and Japan suffered much more severely than other economies from the collapse of world trade, the Japanese became extremely resentful. They tried their best to play the system by the rules, and now they felt the rules were loaded against them. So the economic catastrophe pushed the Japanese to a much more aggressively nationalistic position in the early 1930s.
Japan felt it essential to find new markets for trade and new sources of raw materials. Her eyes turned towards China.
China is people, 450 million of them. If the whole population of China were to walk past you, four abreast, there would never be an end to the procession, for new Chinese would be born and would grow up before the last man could pass by. Of every 5 persons on the face of the earth, 1 is a Chinese.
But if China's population was large, the country was a ripe target for the aggressive Japanese.
China was essentially in a state of chaos by the late 1920s. Competition between the nationalist Chinese on the one hand, the communists on the other, and provincial warlords who were able to establish their own rule over large areas of China, independent of the Chinese government, had produced a situation by the late 1920s where China was effectively ungovernable. And the Japanese realized that and saw an opportunity to consolidate their position because of Chinese weakness.
The Japanese focused their attention on Manchuria and its rich raw materials. Earlier in the 20th century, Japan had acquired control of Manchuria's next-door neighbor, Korea. Japan had treaty rights to station troops along the railway line from Manchuria to the Korean border. It was a potentially explosive situation.
For the officers who ran the Japanese forces in Manchuria, there was never any doubt that Manchuria was vital to Japanese survival in the 1930s as a great state. Their real concern was that the presence of the Japanese in Manchuria was threatened all the time by the rise of Soviet Russia on the one hand, and by the growing anarchy in Chinese politics on the other. Caught between China and Russia, the Japanese soldiers in Manchuria were anxious to do something to secure Japanese interests.
In September 1931, the Japanese struck.
Collision at Mukden. City occupied by Japanese.
Within 4 days, they had occupied towns within a 200-mile radius of Mukden. The Chinese appealed to the League of Nations to intervene. The League asked the Japanese to withdraw, but they weren't interested in any arbitration.
Japan's bombshell for the League. Refusal to accept decision on Manchurian dispute.
What could the League do next? With no America in the League, the attitude of the British government to the dispute was critical. But it was a bad time for Britain. In August 1931, the Labour government had collapsed and was replaced by a national government led by Ramsay MacDonald. The country was in economic crisis. In August 1930, unemployment had reached 2 million as industrial depression grew.
The lads used to march to London. Why not? They'd nothing else to do. The time I went, we got to Hyde Park, and that's about as far as we did get.
Just 2 weeks after the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, there were violent clashes in London between the police and the unemployed. Britain was in no position to support economic or military sanctions against Japan.
For the British, the cost of getting involved in the Manchurian crisis would have been very great indeed. And the finance was not there, and the military equipment was really not there either. Public opinion, of course, was strongly against the idea of being involved in any sort of major war again. So all these considerations were very important in affecting Britain's response to the crisis when it blew up.
The peoples of Britain were completely war-weary in the 1920s. There was a universal revulsion with war. And when in the 1930s the League of Nations appeared to be the solution to their problems, they supported it. But when it came to answering the vital question, are you prepared to go to war to support the League of Nations and to keep the universal peace, the paradox was obvious. To keep the peace, we have to go to war. And the peoples couldn't do it.
The League of Nations could pose no military threat. The Japanese invasion of Manchuria continued. The Daily Express on November 19th reported,
20,000 Chinese put to flight by 5,000 Japanese. Japanese sweep northward.
The League's only response was to set up a commission under Lord Lytton to inquire into the rights and wrongs of the affair. Cartoonist David Lowe wasn't impressed. He showed diplomats of the League of Nations helpless up a tree. Down below, a Japanese soldier was subduing Manchuria. In 1932, the violence spread to Shanghai, 500 miles south of Manchuria. The Japanese shocked the world with their relentless air attacks on densely populated areas.
There was no escape for these surging and panic-stricken people. They could only scurry through the narrow streets, pushing and packing themselves into the center of the city, to be trapped, buried alive in the collapse of bombed and burning buildings.
By February 1932, the Japanese army was in control of the whole of Manchuria. They then renamed it Manchukuo and installed the former Chinese emperor, Henry Puyi, as a puppet ruler.
In his bulletproof car, there he goes, from his temporary palace to the enthronement ceremony, on one of the coldest days of the year in bleak Tsingking or Tsengkung. Arrived at the so-called Temple of Heaven, officers, with eyes in the back of their heads, salute. The Chinese cameraman gets just this glimpse of the new Lord of Manchukuo as he proceeds at a leisurely gait to the mysterious enclosure, where he becomes an emperor for the third time.
And still the League did nothing. The Chinese delegate, Dr. Yen, rebuked it severely.
It is scarcely necessary to me to remind this august body that it is almost a year and 3 months since the Chinese government brought the Manchurian dispute to the attention of the Council. Even today, while we are comfortably discussing questions of a peaceful settlement in this hall, the Japanese are engaged in bombing and machine gunning women and children in the 3 eastern provinces, while fierce battles between the invaders and our people are still the order of the day. For this dispute, if it is not settled in accordance with the principles of the covenant, will affect not only the rights of China, but the very existence of the League itself.
Finally, in February 1933, Lord Lytton's long-awaited report was brought before the League. It condemned the Japanese out of hand, as the Daily Express reported.
League of Nations Commission declares Japan guilty. Aggression planned deliberately.
British Movietone News enables you to witness one of the most momentous episodes in post-war history. The League of Nations meets at Geneva to vote on the report holding Japan responsible for the conflict with China over Manchuria. Before the vote is taken, Mr. Matsuoka of Japan delivers a final address on his country's behalf.
The adoption of this report would give the impression to the Chinese that they had been exonerated from all responsibility, that they could continue to defy Japan with impunity. It would serve further to embitter the feelings of the Japanese and Chinese peoples. I ask you not to adopt this report for the sake of peace in the Far East and for the sake of peace throughout the world.
The dramatic moment has arrived. The chairman announces the result of the ballot. 42 nations out of the 44 present condemn Japan's Manchurian policy.
The Japanese delegates refused to accept the decision and walked out. Japan later announced it was leaving the League. Otherwise, nothing changed. Japan didn't give up Manchuria, and nothing, it seemed, could be done about it.
Japan's exit from the League really did prepare the way for Hitler and Mussolini. British statesmen and officials, when they looked at the crisis in the 1930s, they concentrated on Japan first as the key to explaining what went wrong with the system. It was Japan that led the way. Once Japan had done it, other states could suddenly see that the emperor really had no clothes.
Failure to intervene over Manchuria marked the beginning of the end of the League. Germany had been admitted in 1926, but in 1933, the new Nazi government under Hitler decided to withdraw from the League. But it was Italy and Mussolini that applied the final blow. In 1935, he took the decision to invade Abyssinia. This time, the League did impose limited economic sanctions, but to no avail. In May 1936, the Italians completed the conquest of Abyssinia.
As a peacekeeping organization, it was fatally flawed because of the absence of the United States and of the other great powers too at various times. When it came to the aggressions of Japan in 1931, the League was quite out of the reckoning. And when it came to stopping Mussolini in 1935, or Hitler in 1936 and 1938 and 1939, the League again was hardly considered. It had shot its bolt. As a peacekeeping force, it was ineffective. But it was ineffective not because of its organization, but because the nations which composed it were unwilling to take action. They had no stomach for the action that was required.
It achieved a lot in terms of its health programs, its labor programs, its cultural programs, just like the United Nations since the war. But in terms of achieving and maintaining collective peace, that was something which was always beyond its grasp.
China